The first thing the new owners noticed wasn't anything dramatic. No cold blasts of air. No flickering lights. No whispers in the hall. It was just a sound. A brief, almost polite tapping behind the living room wall, as if someone were knocking from the wrong side of the plaster. It happened on the first morning, barely 20 minutes after they moved in. Mark, who always assumed old houses carried their own noises, told his wife, Elena, that it was probably settling wood. But she didn't answer. She stood in the living room, her hands still wrapped around a cardboard box, staring toward the far corner where an upright piano once sat John Lennon's old writing spot, according to the realtor. They hadn't bought the house because Lennon once lived here. In fact, they only discovered it during a tour of the property. The realtor mentioned it casually, like she was afraid of scaring them off with celebrity history. This is where he stayed in the mid-70s during his separation era. Neighbors say he spent a lot of nights writing here. Then she rushed past the topic. What she didn't mention was what one of the neighbors whispered later. He never really left. It would have sounded like a joke if she hadn't said it so quietly, without a smile, while passing their fence on moving day. But the tapping sound steady, spaced, deliberate made the memory return like a slow shiver. Mark walked over and pressed his palm against the wall. Nothing. The sound stopped instantly, as if whoever or whatever was knocking had felt him get close. The neighbors didn't help the situation. By late afternoon, 3 of them happened to walk by the house, each pretending to casually check their mail or trim their hedges. They stole glances at the living room window. They whispered to each other. One older man even paused, eyes fixed on the corner of the house where John supposedly wrote and recorded rough demos. "You folks heard anything unusual yet?" he asked. "What do you mean, unusual?" Mark replied, trying to sound casual. The man didn't answer. He only gave a soft, uncomfortable nod, as if confirming something to himself, then kept walking. That night, the house seemed normal, quiet, still, clean. But around 2:13 a.m., Elena woke up without knowing why. She wasn't scared, just alert in the way someone becomes when their brain registers something their ears haven't yet caught up to. And then she heard it. Soft piano notes. Just 5 or 6, barely formed, like someone testing keys without pressing fully down. The melody was hesitant, reflective, almost mournful. She sat up, listening, wondering if she was still dreaming. But no, Mark was awake now too, staring at the bedroom door. "You heard that?" she whispered. He nodded. They walked down the hall together, careful not to make noise, as if afraid to interrupt something delicate. The house felt cooler, but not unnaturally so, more like someone had opened a window in the living room and forgotten to close it. But everything was shut. The piano, an old, used upright the couple had purchased a month earlier, sat untouched. Its cover was down. No one had been near it, yet the faint smell of old tobacco lingered in the air. Not sharp or fresh, more like a scent trapped in old wood, suddenly released. Mark lifted the piano cover. Elena whispered, "Don't." But curiosity won. He pressed one key lightly. Nothing. He pressed another. Same. He sighed, almost relieved. Then he saw the dust. There were fingerprints on the piano lid, 3 partial smudges. Human-sized, long, narrow, as if someone had rested their hand there only minutes earlier. And they didn't match Mark's hand or Elena's. The size, the spread of the fingers different. Neither of them spoke for almost a full minute. That's when the hallway floor behind them creaked, one simple shift of weight, like someone taking a single step toward the living room. They turned in perfect sync. No one was there. Only the dim, quiet house and the unsettling feeling that they had just walked in on someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who used to write music in this very room. Someone who, according to the neighbors, never really left. The next morning arrived gray and strangely quiet, as though the light itself hesitated to enter the house. Neither Mark nor Elena had slept much. They replayed the faint piano notes over and over in their minds, each trying to rationalize them: air pressure, temperature changes, old strings shifting. The fingerprints were harder to explain, but tiredness can make the impossible feel slightly bendable. Maybe they brushed against the lid without noticing. Maybe the piano tuner last week had left them, though neither recalled smudges during the move. They tried to get through breakfast like nothing had happened. But even coffee tasted metallic, like nerves had seeped into the water. A knock came at their door around 9:30 a.m. A woman in her mid-50s stood outside, wearing a faded Beatles shirt, not the kind bought online but an old tour version with small cracks in the print. She introduced herself as Karen, the neighbor directly across the street. Her expression wasn't unfriendly, but her eyes held the heavy, cautious understanding of someone who knew more than she was saying. "I saw your lights on late," she said gently. "Rough first night." They exchanged a wary glance. "You heard something," she added, not asking, stating. Elena stepped aside to let her in. Somehow it felt rude not to. Karen walked into the living room and looked toward the piano corner immediately, as if pulled there by a memory. "That's where he spent most nights," she murmured. "You know, back when he lived here for a while, he'd sit right in that corner. Sometimes writing, sometimes humming to himself. Sometimes nothing at all, just thinking." "You lived here during that time?" Mark asked. "Oh, everyone around here remembers those years," she said. "But it's not the music that lingers." She didn't continue. Instead, she pressed her fingers against the wall near the baseboard, the same area where the tapping sound had come from the day before. "You heard this, didn't you?" she asked. Mark felt a cold, crawling sensation. "Yes, yesterday morning. That's how it always starts," she whispered. Before they could ask what she meant, she stood up straighter, as if regretting how much she had said. She forced a smile that didn't match the tension in her jaw. "Well, settling walls and old pipes can play tricks on you," she said quickly. "If you need anything, I'm right across the street." And she left almost as soon as she arrived, her earlier confidence leaking away like air from a punctured tire. The house felt heavier after she left, as if her unspoken warnings soaked into the walls. That evening, the tapping returned. Not loud, not aggressive, just present, like a polite knock from a room they didn't have a door to. This time, Elena recorded it on her phone. When the sound appeared again, 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, she looked at Mark with wide eyes. It was rhythmic, purposeful, not random. They hovered near the wall, listening as the tapping shifted slightly upward, as if whoever was behind it was moving their hand higher. Then it stopped. Not faded, just stopped, mid-pattern. The silence afterward felt deeper than before. Hours later, long past midnight, when the house was asleep except for its 2 anxious new owners, something else happened. It started with the faint sound of footsteps, slow, measured, unmistakably human, making their way down the hall. Not in a threatening way, but with a kind of hesitant intention, like someone lost in their own home. Mark sat up immediately. He reached for the small lamp, but Elena grabbed his wrist. "Don't turn it on," she whispered. "Just listen." The footsteps were light but definite, pacing near the threshold of their bedroom. They didn't come closer. They didn't retreat. They simply lingered, like someone standing outside a door unsure whether to knock. A soft, almost imperceptible exhale followed, like a person sighing, or releasing a breath they'd been holding for far too long. Valves in the house clicked. Wood expanded. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Ordinary sounds, familiar ones. But that exhale, neither machine nor house structure could make a human exhale. Elena felt the hairs on her arms rise. Then the footsteps turned, gently, and moved down the hall toward the living room. A moment later came a single piano note, just one, low and soft, as if someone had brushed the key lightly with the side of their hand. Mark and Elena stepped into the hallway with cautious steps. They didn't see anything unusual, but something about the air felt different, charged, almost faintly expectant. When they reached the living room, the piano cover was still closed. But there, again, was the smell, old cigarette smoke. Faint, but unmistakable. Not the harsh smell of fresh smoke. More like the ghost of a scent long absorbed by wood and fabric. The house wasn't trying to scare them. It was trying to say something. And for the first time, both of them felt that whoever had been here before wasn't simply repeating old moments. He was aware of them. He knew they were listening. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. For the next 2 days, the house behaved strangely, but not in ways that screamed danger. It was subtle, like a presence learning its boundaries, adjusting itself around the 2 living occupants. The tapping still came from time to time, mostly in the late morning or early afternoon. The footsteps at night grew softer, hesitant, as if testing how close they could come before being noticed. And the scent, faint tobacco mixed with something older, almost metallic, returned only when the living room was empty. It didn't feel hostile, but it didn't feel passive either. It felt like someone pacing in a room with unfinished business. By the 3rd evening, Mark suggested they try documenting everything, not because he was convinced the house was haunted, but because he needed evidence, some record to analyze later instead of relying solely on memory. So they set up a small audio recorder near the piano and left it running while they watched a late movie in bed. Both pretended to pay attention to the screen, but their thoughts drifted again and again to the living room. Around 1:50 a.m., the house shifted. They felt it before they heard anything, a slight pressure in the air, like a room tightening around them. Moments later came the soft, uneven footsteps from the hallway. Only this time, they didn't pause outside the bedroom. They passed directly in front of the half-closed door, slow and steady, the weight of each step pressing gently into the wooden floorboards. Mark saw the shadow first, a faint, elongated blur that crossed the sliver of light under the door. It looked like the silhouette of legs moving quietly, not in a hurry, but with intention. Elena sat up so quickly she pushed her pillow to the floor. The footsteps drifted toward the living room. Then, a soft click. The piano cover had been lifted. Not thrown open, not forced, just lifted with the gentleness of someone who respected instruments. Mark and Elena didn't rush to the living room this time. They waited in silence, their breathing controlled, trying to hear anything that could be explained by wind, pipes, settling with anything familiar. But what followed wasn't familiar. It wasn't even exactly music. It was a half-formed melody, played so lightly it sounded like fingertips brushing keys instead of pressing them fully down. A fractured sequence, 2 notes, pause, 3 notes, another pause. As though someone was searching for a lost fragment of a song but couldn't find the right combination. It lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then everything went quiet. The silence afterward had a pulse, a tension that stretched between rooms. Finally, they stood, the instinct to follow stronger than fear. They stepped into the hall, and the lights above flickered, once the kind of flicker a power surge causes, but not enough to turn anything off. In the living room, the piano cover was indeed open, tilted backward just enough to show the keys underneath. The dust on the surface was disturbed in a smooth arc, not from fingers, but from the cover having been lifted. Mark approached first, but something odd caught Elena's attention on the far side of the room. The framed photograph by the window, one of the original photos left by the previous owner, was tilted. Not fallen, not about to fall, but perfectly angled, as if someone had nudged the bottom corner with the side of their hand. It was the only object in the room that had moved, and it wasn't a picture of them. It wasn't a picture of the previous owner either. It was a candid black and white shot of John Lennon walking through the garden outside the very house they were standing in. His head was slightly lowered, hands in his pockets, looking almost protective of the space around him. Elena leaned close. Beneath the glass, faint specks of dust resembled fingerprints, not sharp, not recent, but smudged as though brushed against by an unseen hand. "Why that one?" she whispered. Mark didn't answer. His attention was fixed on the piano. He slowly pressed the same key they'd heard as the last note earlier. The sound rang out cleanly, too cleanly, as if the instrument had been lightly tuned or warmed up. Then he noticed something else. One single key had a faint smudge on its edge, barely visible. A small streak, as if a fingertip had grazed it from above. Elena backed up until she reached the wall, her breathing quickening. "Someone is trying to communicate," she said. "But why us? Why now?" Mark sat on the piano bench, elbows on his knees, rubbing his forehead. "I don't know," he said. "But whatever's happening, it didn't start with us." They spent the next hour walking quietly through the house, checking windows, doors, and vents, trying to reassure themselves with logic. Every door was locked, every window shut, no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no drafts strong enough to move anything. But as they circled back toward the living room, Elena paused. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. First, Mark didn't. Then, very faintly, through the wall behind the piano corner, came a sound. Not tapping this time. A soft, rhythmic scratching. Slow, deliberate, like someone writing on the other side with something dull. Mark pressed his ear close to the wall. The scratching paused, then started again. It wasn't random. It had a pattern, a strange, slow up-and-down movement, as if someone was sketching something over and over in the same spot. Elena stared at him, fear and curiosity intertwining. "What is he trying to draw?" she whispered. Mark didn't answer, because deep in his chest, a realization began to grow. This wasn't just noise. It wasn't just memory. It was trying to communicate something specific, something the house had been holding onto for decades. The scratching behind the wall continued for nearly a full minute before fading into silence. Not an abrupt stop, more like someone letting go of a thought mid-sentence. The house felt motionless afterward, as if holding its breath. Even the refrigerator hum seemed distant, swallowed by a sudden, heavy stillness. Mark stepped back from the wall, shaken, and looked at Elena. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't panicked. She looked focused, almost as if she finally understood the shape of something she'd been sensing since the first night. "We should open it," she whispered. "The wall." "Yes, whatever he's trying to tell us is in there." The idea felt reckless, but the logic strangely felt sound. This wasn't random activity. The tapping, the footsteps, the piano, the picture frame turned just so. Everything pointed toward something specific in that corner. They gathered tools quietly, as if afraid to disrupt the equilibrium that had settled over the house. Mark used a flashlight, running the beam across the paint, the seams, the wooden trim. He tapped gently. The hollow area behind the wall was obvious now that he knew what to listen for. He slid a thin blade along a seam and pried loose a small square of old drywall. The air behind it was cold. Not icy, just stale, untouched for years, the kind of cold that sinks into walls left sealed for too long. Inside was a narrow cavity, only a few inches wide. First, it seemed empty. Then Mark angled the flashlight differently and saw the edge of something buried in dust. A small, flat object wrapped in thin, yellowed paper. He reached in carefully and pulled it out. The paper flaked apart almost instantly, revealing a battered cassette tape. Plain one. No label. No writing. Just the texture of old plastic that had survived decades in a silent grave. Elena covered her mouth with her hand. "No way," she whispered. They took it to the kitchen table like it was a fragile artifact from a museum. The couple didn't own a cassette player, but Karen might. So, at 2:40 in the morning, they crossed the street and knocked quietly on her door. Karen answered in a robe, not looking surprised, more resigned, as if she had been expecting the knock before they even raised their hand. "You found something," she said without question. She didn't hesitate. She led them into her living room, pulled an old radio cassette deck from a shelf, and set the tape inside as gently as if it were a heartbeat. She pressed play. For a few seconds, there was nothing but static. Not harsh, just soft white noise, like wind gently brushing a microphone. Then under it another sound appeared. Piano. Soft, hesitant. The same broken pattern they had heard echoing through the house at night. Except here, the notes were clearer, thoughtful, like someone searching for a melody they couldn't quite capture. A man's breath followed, steady, controlled. Then a voice. Faint, intimate, almost a whisper. "Take two." Mark felt the hair rise on his arms. Elena froze. The voice wasn't loud, wasn't theatrical. It sounded like someone recording a private idea. Late at night, alone with an instrument and unfinished thoughts. More piano chords followed, still slow, still incomplete, but now part of something larger. A structure, maybe a draft of a song that never made it past this first fragile fragment. Karen closed her eyes when she heard it. "He used to play like that at night," she said softly. Not for anyone. Just to clear his head. At the end of the tape came a moment of pure silence. No clicks. No movement. Just a long pause, as if he had stepped away for a breath he never returned from. And then the tape ended. The room was quiet. "What is this?" Mark whispered. Karen smiled sadly. "My guess? A demo. One nobody ever found. He must have hidden it when things got complicated." She didn't have to explain. The mid-70s were turbulent years. Personal, emotional, artistic. Elena looked shaken but calm. "Then why all the activity? Why us?" Karen's gaze shifted to the window, toward the house they now lived in. "Maybe because you actually listened," she said. "This street has seen people come and go for decades. Most dismissed the noises, the tapping, the music. They brushed it off as old house problems. But some things stay restless if no one acknowledges them." As they walked home, tape in hand, the house looked different. Not threatening, not ominous, just relieved. The air inside felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted not only from the walls, but from the space between moments. That night, nothing stirred. No footsteps, no tapping behind the wall, no soft piano notes drifting through the dark. The presence, whatever it had been, was gone. But before sunrise, as the first pale light reached the piano corner, the couple noticed one last thing. The picture frame that had been tilted was now set perfectly straight-aligned, centered, almost intentionally precise. A quiet acknowledgement, a nod, a thank you. And in that fragile morning stillness, Mark understood something simple and profound. Some echoes don't want to frighten. They just want to be found. And once they are, they finally fall silent. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.